I had to live it. I had to experience it. And I think so often people either don't want to read it to begin with, but then don't want to experience it. And so I was very fortunate with people like Jamie and people like Morris Manyfingers and people like Annette Brewsted, and then some really unbelievable elders who took the time to show me. That's why the work I'm doing right now with KTCEA, which is a First Nations Education Authority in Northern Alberta, that's been helpful because I've experienced those things. And so I have a different lens when I walk in. And I think that's where we as Canadians have to do. We have to do some research and find out what the truth is. But then we have to experience some of the tragedies and travesties of justice that were there, to see them, but also to see the rich culture and tradition and hear the language that they speak. Is you have a beautiful language, you have a beautiful culture, you have beautiful traditions. How are we going to make sure that we continue them all the way through?
The whole podcast has been, and I've said before, kind of a love letter to Canada and to Canadian educators. And, it's pretty difficult to try to sum up in a few words what makes Canadian leaders in particular special and unique. And I suppose you could look at any part of the world and find some common traits. But I will say that my experience tells me the authenticity and the genuine desire to learn is something that rings true with so many of our Canadian leaders. And Chris Smeaton is somebody who just exemplifies that. Here's somebody who's, and again, we toyed with the word retired because he's retired from being a superintendent, but he's still very active in supporting school boards and leaders in education. But, when Chris tells his story about his journey into trying to understand Indigenous culture and Indigenous education, you just really get a sense that here's somebody who genuinely wants to get it right. This is not a show. This is not something he's doing for anyone else. And he still, to this day, maintains his journey. He doesn't have to keep reading about all this stuff. And yet he still wants to better understand how we can support, such a critical and important culture in Canada. So that's the overwhelming vibe that you'll get from this conversation. And Chris is somebody I have known for a lot of years, respected in so many ways. And he and I share a lot of commonalities, our joys of being grandparents. We didn't talk about golf at all in this podcast. We could have done that, but we didn't talk about that. But we share a lot of things in common. And again, well, what a treat just to hear Chris talk about the work that he's doing, the work that he's done and led in the past and continues to do. And so thank you, Chris, for this conversation. And I hope the rest of you enjoy my conversation with Chris Smeaton. Chris, what are you reading right now?
Well, I was at CASA this summer and I listened to the authors. I got them right here: Andrew Strobo Snyderman and Douglas Sanderson, The Valley of the Birdtail. And, the title, An Indian Reserve, a White Town, and the Road to Reconciliation. And, we did lots of work in my previous district around reconciliation and works for, we're right beside Kainai, which is the largest landmass reserve in Canada. And so I always thought that I'm pretty good in terms of understanding of some of the history. And this book really nails it. I would suggest that every single teacher, every single adult, it should be a mandatory read for college and university, especially education students, because it really helps people understand, not so much around the residential schools, because that's probably more known, but just the government's role in our issues with the First Nations people of the area. And it's a brilliant read. It's a sad read when you're Canadian, and it's I never thought about that, but it's a brilliant book to read. I've already shared it with a number of people, and they're getting on it right away. So That's I just finished that, so I'll be picking up something new here in the next little bit.
Well, let me ask you about that. As somebody who's been in Canadian education for over 30 years, those early days of my education, we were just starting to talk about First Nations education. Like it hadn't been anything before that. So here you are as a superintendent, and you've been on this journey for a while. What is it about that you've learned over time that continues to say to you, this is an important thing? This is not a fad. This is not something that is going to come and go, but this is something that we need to continue to think about and implement and get better at as a school system.
Yeah. Well, I think that, I think Justice Murray Sinclair said truth and reconciliation, and we need to know the truth first. And I think we've glossed over the truth. And I think that's a really important piece. So when people say, "Oh yeah, those, they get, they don't have to pay taxes, and they get their houses, and they get this, and they get that," and that's where it stops. And so you get a book like this, and you have to dig a little bit. You have to say, "Well, what does that really mean?" My best example, and I still remember this, is when we lived in Lethbridge, the Blood Bus Co-op in the winter would cancel, and sometimes in the spring and stuff. And I would say, well, why are they always canceling the runs? We got kids who want to come into school. Why do they always want to cancel? And so I remember one of my first hires was a lady by the name of Jamie Medicine Crane. I brought her in as a First Nations lead teacher in our division, and she said, "We're going to go and visit the reserve. We're going to go and visit the Kainai board." And so it was myself and our board chair and Jamie and maybe a couple other people. And she said, "I'm gonna show you where I grew up." And so we went to where her house would have been. And she said, "Now you think about the snow. The bus isn't going in there to get us, so we would have to walk, and it was quarter mile, half mile off the main road or a side road to get there." And then I remember her saying, "We need to leave now because the wind started blowing." And I said, "What do you mean we need to leave?" She says, "Because if we don't leave now, we will be stuck here because the road will be, you know, snowed over and we will be stuck in this area." And I went, "Okay, I just got it." Right. I just got it, but I had to live it. I had to experience it. And I think so often people either don't want to read it to begin with, but then don't want to experience it. And so I was very fortunate with people like Jamie and people like Morris Manyfingers and people like Annette Brewsted, who, and some really unbelievable elders who took the time to kind of show me, right? And, that's why the work I'm doing right now with KTCEA, which is a First Nations Education Authority in Northern Alberta, that's been helpful because I've experienced those things. And so I have a different lens when I walk in. And I think that's where we as Canadians have to do. We have to do some research and find out what the truth is. But then we have to experience, some of the tragedies and travesties of justice that were there to see them, but also to see the rich culture and tradition and hear the language that they speak. I'm going to be keynoting their convention here, and that's going to be my kind of sole focus. Is you have a beautiful language, you have a beautiful culture, you have beautiful traditions. How are we going to make sure that we continue them all the way through? Right?
Yeah, I mean, what underlies everything that you just said is relationships and the fact that you want to understand people and where you come from, and you can read it in
Yeah.
a book and you can hear this, but I think, and that's where I think we probably struggle the most as a society is, you kind of reference people's stereotypes and different things that they might say about a culture largely because they're ignorant, right? They don't know
Yeah.
anybody, they haven't experienced it. So I think that's powerful. And we'll kind of circle back, I think, to some of these ideas, but I want to just also set the stage for I don't do I call you retired Superintendent Chris Smeaton? Like, how would you describe yourself now in your world now? Like, what
Well,
are what is how does Chris Smeaton see himself in the world of education today?
and as of tomorrow, that'll be my fourth year anniversary of retiring from superintendent schools. So I've been out of the game for 4 years, and I stayed fully retired for 16 months. My wife was a little surprised. My two kids, they thought dad would be working, 2 days after I retired, but excuse me. But then I started, Nelson, first of all, called and asked if I could do some education advising for them. And I said, yeah, as long as it doesn't, and you can appreciate this, interfere with the grandkids. And they said, absolutely. And they've been true to their word all the way through. So we went from 1 day to 2 days a week in a little bit. And then a colleague of mine was a superintendent, said, can you start doing some board work, you know? And I said, well, I went through 19 board governance sessions and evaluations of board and evaluations. And yeah, I think I got a pretty good understanding of those type of things. And so I started a little consulting business. And I think most superintendents, you could probably, once they retire, you could probably call them consultants for one way or another. So
Sure.
that's kind of where I am. The beauty is, and this, Dean, is I get to pick and choose, right? So, tomorrow I've got a busy day, but next Monday we've got our granddaughter. Well, guess what? I'm not doing anything that day. And that's the beauty about it. So
Yeah.
it's retirement with the ability to pick and choose what I want to do.
Well, and you put in all those years of education there. If you aren't doing some sort of support consulting work, it's a waste, right? Like I got all this knowledge and stuff that people need to tap into. So that I think it's and then you're just having the luxury of having that pick and choose thing. So what would you say? Let's do this. Let's do two parts to this question. I because one of the
Okay.
questions is like, what are you most proud of? And I'd like you to talk about what you're most proud of in your previous tenure as superintendent. So that could be thinking about anything you did, whether it was with Lethbridge or anything else. And then what are you most proud of now in the work that you're doing?
So if I go back to when I started as superintendent back in 2009, we had a very fractured system. There was no trust, none at all. And I'm not. It's not a matter of pointing fingers at anybody. That's what it was. The board was not well liked. Central office was not liked. There was no camaraderie between schools. There was us and them, and so I think that was my main goal. And to be fair, I have to say, when I went in with that board, I said, if you want me to fix this, then you need to allow me to fix it through relationships. Right. And I said, so some of the other things that you think might be important or were important may not be as important until we get this done. And credit to them, they said yes. 15, 18 schools, what we had there over the time. I was in schools between 120 and 130 times a year. About 40% of those were instructional, but the other 60% were just getting to know. And I used to say, I need you to know me as Chris, the superintendent, but also Chris, the husband, and Chris, the dad, and Chris,
Right.
you know, grandpa. And that's why I use the social media piece for that as well. I needed people to see me more than just that. But we were able to build a really strong, trusting environment that began to spawn some really good innovations. You've heard me say this before. My tagline was fail forward. I expect all of us to fail miserably, trying to do things differently to be better for kids. And you're not going to get the superintendent with a big hammer smacking you down because you made a mistake. You're going to get a congratulations. What did we learn? Where do we need to go from there? And then we started to go from a divisions of schools to a school division, right? So we were very site based when I first came in.
Right.
And I'm not saying that site based is bad or not, but it was problematic for us because we had schools, on one side or each side of the river fighting for the same students, right? And we said, well, what are you doing? Why are you transporting them from west to east and back? Well, because we want them here. And no, no, no. And so we went to a needs based funding model, and suddenly I had a school division, right? And so we built some really strong leaders in the schools, which to me has been always the most important. I mean, I remember
Right.
learning this a long time ago, right? The most influential person in a school division isn't your superintendent, it's your principal.
Right.
And so if
That's
you
right.
spend a lot of time with the principal, right, you're going to have good schools. And so
Absolutely.
we spend a lot of time with it. I had an activity, and I know we had a smaller division, but this is an activity that I've shared with many. is every single January, I had a future plan meetings with every single one of our administrators, whether they were in central office or in schools. And, you do the 1, 3, what's your 1, 3, 5 years? And if you're going to move to a different school, what three would you like to go to? And are there three administrators you'd like to work with? And those were all great questions, right? But the one question that leveraged everything is, where do you want to be when you retire? At what position do you want to be when you retire?
Mm.
So I said, let's just assume you're 55 and you're 33 now. You've got 22 years to get there. What do we need to do to help you get there? So then suddenly it was a collaboration between the administrator and myself in trying to help them get to their point of where, and I, lots of times I was long gone, but when we talked about it, they suddenly saw, okay, if I go here or I do this, or I need to do this. And it made it very clear that they started to help, I helped them create a path to where they wanted to end up in the retirement. And that activity, Dean, was probably the most successful activity I could have ever led
Interesting.
because it gains great trust with them,
Mhm.
great honesty with them. And they knew that I was part of their team. I wasn't just a superintendent asking them questions that were for the organization. It was for the organization and for their benefit.
I think the thing I would add to that with my own knowledge is I remember having a conversation with you, and this was just after recently after an election in Alberta where the government had come in and Alberta, I think in my time in the early 2000s, I think would have arguably been what I would have viewed as the most innovative province we had, because you guys had, was it SuperNet? Like, you
Yeah.
guys were really ahead of the game in that. So people were looking to
It-
Alberta as like, okay, these guys are really, and there was a lot of investment in that. And then that also led to a lot of change in curriculum in terms of project-based learning and more holistic kind of outcomes. And the government had come in and there was this back to the basic, whatever, like that we hear the rhetoric around what that change was. And I
yeah.
remember you saying, because I asked you about that, I said, "What are you going to do now, Chris? Because you guys have gone all this journey around innovation. Now the government's wanting to say, no, 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 we want to." And I remember you saying, I've told my people, just keep your head down, keep doing what you're doing. I'll sort of take the heat and figure out what it is. I don't want you to think that we're changing course, because you were, pretty proud of the direction that you had started. And I just remember thinking, like, there's a principal that's got their backs in terms of, and so that relationship has to, at some, you can say all you want about relationship, but until you actually act on that and show them that you care about them and that you're doing it, it's a little bit fleeting. So I don't know if you remember that, or you can
Yeah.
add even more context to that stage, but I thought that was a powerful leadership choice you made.
We're- I think we did that in Charlevoix, actually. The conversation was when we were in Charlevoix for ERDI. But, one of the things that I said is if we know what's good for kids, then let's make sure we do it. And again, when you're a long serving superintendent and you're well known in the communities that you are, and I was well known, right? I was in, I would attend school council meetings and talk to them about what we're trying to do and why what we used to do may have been good enough for them, but is not good enough for your kids. When I always framed it around that way, there was some really, really good commitment. Like, I mean, we had a good community, right? And that was very much based on relationship. But then we would go back and say, this is what our kids need. This is what your children need to be successful. The old adage, we're preparing kids for their future, not our past. That sounds like a silly statement, but it's so powerful.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so when you have some of those flip flops in terms of government changes and, we need to do this and we need to do that, our system really said, hey, what's most important for kids? Right? What are the key learning outcomes? Right? What do they really need to know to be successful going into the next grade? Because curriculum is always way too long and there's very little depth. So let's look at what's critical. We can call them essential outcomes. There's all kinds of different words out there, but what is most important for these children to be successful going forward? And as long as we kept on focusing on that, we had pretty successful schools.
Yeah.
When we started to go away from it and listen to the noise at the provincial government, then, you know, the impact that was happening in the classrooms just wasn't there as much. And I think, to be very fair, being in Lethbridge, we were a long way from the provincial government. So we could hide a little bit, right? And we could do lots of things that the government didn't even, I'm not going to say didn't know about, but really didn't care. We're, 5,500, 5,000 students. Who cares? They're doing that. And yet, there was all kinds of people from around Canada saying, well, how are you doing this? How are you doing that? How are you doing this? And so again, going back to that motivation and that affirmation to our leadership team, that helped, move it along again. When we had people coming and saying, can you show us how you're doing this? And can you show us how we're doing that? Then they would say, hey, we must be doing something right. And,
Well,
and,
and
and they would get all the, yeah, I would go. Right.
and again, I think this, you talk about your message of failing forward and so forth. And I remember, I think I read it on your blog at some point. You wrote about just the myth of whether it's a curriculum police or whomever else that people sort of have
Yeah.
made up around, like, oh, there's all these restrictions, and you're like, there aren't as many restrictions as you might think they are,
No.
and I think that takes a while for a culture to change, people's perception that, well, I have to, these are the really narrow, bumpers that I have to stay within. And actually it's a little bit wider than you might think. But until somebody says it out loud, and not only says it out loud, but says it out loud repeatedly, shows examples of, "Well, here's how we, sort of gone away what my people think," that then I don't think it's real. So it's, culture is something that it takes time. It doesn't happen in a memo or even a blog post. It takes time to live those things out. So
And then
tell
the,
me.
the other piece that's
Go ahead.
important with that, sorry, Dean, is then the how do you know, right? And so we would always ask the question, how do you know? And that's where we were able to bring data back into it,
Right,
right? Because you can't, oh, this is great. Well, how do you know? And so that became a question that we all asked. A teacher would say, it was a great class. How do you know? Right? It wasn't accusatory. It was
right.
just, I want you to be reflective of that, right?
Well,
So
and there's another one that, like, that's a great question that, if it's not asked continually, gets dumbed down to the lowest common denominator, and so now we're just using, numbers and the simplest form. But if you keep asking, "How do you know?" You begin to expand what that means, because then you do share the story, you share the anecdotes, you share all kinds of measures that you maybe hadn't thought about before, because it's a simple question that has some complexity to it as well. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about, what you're proud of in your work right now, and you kind of touched on a few things, but maybe there's something specific that comes to mind.
yeah, it's interesting because if anybody would ask me while I was a superintendent if I'd ever be doing work with the board, I would have said they were crazy. And yet I fell into it. And it's been really, really enjoyable. And I'm working with some very high functioning boards. I'm working with some low functioning boards that are just, but all of them have a desire to get better. But one of the pieces that I start with is, how are you irreplaceable, right? And of course, everybody's, oh yeah, no, we do. I said, no, no, actually, you're not. I mean, there's places in Canada that don't have school boards, and they're just going tickety boo. There's no problem with them.
Right.
So, what do you need to do that makes you irreplaceable? Because if you suddenly got shut down from the government tomorrow, there's a couple things. One, the school system would continue to function and continue to function well, right? There might be some transition, and there wouldn't be uproar in the public, right, as a whole, right? Because no one knows what you do. So we start to work on that premise of, okay, how do you make yourself irreplaceable? And then we kind of look at their four co-modes, right? Their fiduciary mode, their strategic, their generative, and then their innovative. I've added that piece in. So
Mm,
that generative piece is important and that innovative piece is important. So what are you doing to make sure that people know what you're doing and how important your role is? How are you advocating for the system as a whole? What are some of the things you're doing that need to be far clearer? And so when I'm asking boards questions like this, they're starting to dig a little deeper into their own role, not not getting into operations, but through a governance lens. And so, what's really exciting is, I've got these boards who are saying, you know, come back next year, come back in 6 months, and we want to dig a little deeper. I'm going up and seeing a board next week, and I'm doing 2 new sessions with them, 2 new workshops with them, because they're going deeper all the time. And I'm going, that's what boards need to do.
Right.
Instead of doing the old self evaluation that they would do once a year, where they would pat themselves on the back and carry on. If boards are supposed to be or going to be irreplaceable, then they need to do a lot more work around that governance core and governance lens. And it's exciting to watch these board members roll up their sleeves and dig in and say, I get this. And then it helps the superintendent and the system so much when they can work in that generative area, and systems will improve. And ultimately, and you know me well enough. Ultimately, if I'm not doing any of this work without kids in mind, then I shouldn't be doing it. Like I have a picture of our grandkids in every single presentation I have, because I said, that's my why. What's your
Yeah.
why?
Yeah,
Because if
exactly.
that's not your why, then you shouldn't be there. And I certainly shouldn't be helping you out.
This episode is brought to you by Advanced Learning Partnerships, also known as ALP. We are a professional learning consulting group that serves communities across North America. We are partners, designers, and agents for change. You can learn more about the work we do at alplearn.com. And now back to the show. In a nutshell, Chris, what makes an effective board?
Well, I think everybody falls back to that fiduciary role, that oversight, and that's
Sure.
important. I mean, that's critical. You got $120 million budget, whatever. You should be pretty careful about how you're spending it. I think the strategic piece is critical. I know the superintendent is going to, or the director is going to do a lot of the road mapping, but paint that picture. But I don't think you can paint that picture well until you do your generative piece, where you're getting into communities and saying, what do our kids need? So, I mean, I would suggest that, I know it's an old document now, but Inspiring Ed, the graduates of 2030, like, we're only 4 or 6 years away now. It's
Hmm.
2024. That was a brilliant document, right? Where are we towards that? And so that generative piece is, you know, whether it's through surveys or town halls or something like that, ensuring that the community really knows why the school board is running, but also why the school board needs to go in such and such direction, right? And then the innovative piece, and I say boards, it's not that you are innovative in yourself. I said, but create an atmosphere where your senior team and your schools can be innovative.
Right.
Right? You just create that atmosphere, that environment. And that's what Holy Spirit did for me. They created an environment where I could just run. And I will be forever grateful for that, because that's what made the difference. Right. So that generative piece, I think, is critical to lead into the strategic. And that innovative piece then is opening up the door so that we don't continue to maintain the status quo.
Oh, it's powerful. And I think the work you're doing is just fantastic. So let's talk a little bit specifically about leadership and how and again, I think what you described earlier about helping all of your district leaders think about their future, whatever. But if you were talking to a 25-year-old in education who's thinking, maybe that they're teaching right now and they're thinking about a role in leadership, what advice would you give them as they think about leadership for their future?
Well, it's interesting because there's 5 school divisions around Edmonton, 5 Catholic school divisions, and I teach what they call XL, which is Excellence in Catholic Education Leadership, through Newman Theological College. 2-year program, 5 full days each year. And that's what they are. They're either current or aspiring leaders. And I think, the one piece that is front and center in the standards in Alberta is fostering effective relationships, right? You can't have effective leaders without building effective relationships. And I think it's got a bad rap. I think a lot of people think effective relationships is you don't make tough decisions or you don't do those things. I think When you are really relational, you probably make more difficult decisions because you're looking out for the individual across the way, right? If you terminate a contract or you move someone out of it, if you're doing it for spiteful reasons, shame on you. If you're doing it through a relational piece of, I think this is going to be better for this individual, that's the piece. So I see there's a couple. So one is, you know, how do you build relationships and how do you foster them? And then the other one, if you're going to be a leader, is how good are you at being an instructional leader? Because really, that's what I'm paying you to do. I'm going to pay you to build relationships, and I pay you to be an instructional leader. So how are you fostering that? What are you reading? What are you doing? How are you getting to classrooms? What's cutting edge technologies? Those are all important pieces that if and when you get into that leadership role are going to be critical, because you can't move a school ahead without really strong relationships, and you can't move pedagogy ahead if you don't know pedagogy
Right.
and you can't
Right.
help people learn it, right? So
Well,
those are two to me pretty critical things.
yeah, and to echo that last point, and again, and I think we talked about this maybe earlier, when I look at particularly superintendents, there there are there aren't that many in Canada. A few, I find there may be more in the US who maybe don't have the same level of understanding of pedagogy. And I'll tell you a quick story. I remember this, and you may have been there. I don't remember, but I remember sort of hearing through the grapevine. It might have been a C21 event where all the superintendents had to give like an ignite talk. And it was clear, somebody said it was clear through that little 5-minute thing, which of those superintendents really did understand pedagogy and which of them didn't. And it's difficult. Again, I think there's room for all kinds of leaders, but to your point about you understanding why we're doing this for kids, like being able to speak
Yeah.
with some credibility around what good teaching and learning looks like, I think is something that it's difficult to move forward in a school district if you don't have that level of understanding. So I always remember that idea.
That 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 piece, Dean, is why was I in school so often? Is like I said, 40% was instructional, 60%, but getting into classrooms, and through a cognitive coaching format, asking teachers why they were doing some things and looking at them going, what are some reasons that blank, and engaging them in conversation, it helped them be self-reflective. But boy, then I can walk out into another classroom and saying, what might be some ways that you would incorporate blank?
Sure.
Right. So I never wanted to lose the feeling of being a teacher. I mean, I taught adult education for years as a superintendent, both through Gonzaga and now with Newman. I always said, the moment that I don't want to be a teacher anymore, then I need to retire. Now I retired and I still wanted to be a teacher, so that's good. But I
Mhm.
think I think some superintendents lose that piece.
Sure.
Like it's great to be a leader, but we should always be a teacher at heart.
Well, and doing regular learning walks, and I mean, they can be formal, or there's more formal ways of doing that. But and I think even too, opening your eyes to, like, if you were a high school teacher or an elementary, whatever your background was, well, like, what's the nuance difference between grade levels, right? And you don't come in there as it's not about expertise so much as it is about
No, no,
curiosity and a general understanding. And
no.
like you said, what when I ask why are you doing this, it's not to test you. It's because I actually want to learn why and be able to articulate that to others because it's effective. I saw kids learn. I saw kids engaged. I saw things happening, and I want to be able to understand why that is, right? So and I mean, it's just I think that's the joy and the privilege of having a diverse group of teachers who they don't all do it the same way, right? Like there's some, and that's the cool thing, right? Like I don't want robots. I want them to bring their personality and their skills, but they also need to be able to learn with and from each other to build upon those. And that doesn't happen unless there's somebody that's kind of prompting those questions and those ideas. But
Well, and it's affirming, right?
yes.
And our teachers and leaders don't get affirmed, nearly enough. especially from general public. So,
Absolutely.
superintendent comes in and can affirm good practice. Man, they're walking out of that classroom pretty darn happy. And because they knew me so well, I'm not going to say that they didn't get nervous when I walk into the classroom because, I was still the superintendent, but they were more familiar with it. It wasn't, oh, he's coming now and he's coming back and again another 5 years, right? But
Right.
that affirmation piece is so important for people in general. So,
Well, okay, so let's build upon affirmation, and this is sort of my new ad. I started asking a few people at the end of my podcast, and ironically enough, you were the first person that got a shout out from Simone Gessler because I asked about
yes.
name a person who you are in education that you're grateful for. And I wanted this to be, I didn't want this to be like, well, I'm going to name my wife or somebody, that way. I want this to be somebody specific that's currently working in schools with kids, however, but just somebody that you're saying, I am grateful for this person so that maybe they're listening to this and they get a little affirmation as you've talked about. So who in your world today, Chris, do you want to give a little bit of a shout out to and that you're grateful for?
Well, I'm going to go back though. So this lady now unfortunately has dementia, but she was my first principal when I went into admin. So I was 29 years old. I was brash. I'd just gone from a 10 to 12 school to a K to 12, no visible First Nations, Métis or Inuit students to a 70% population. And the principal's name was Dorothy Cowell, and she hired me as a VP, allowed me to build the high school program. And I just remember so many times that I just made all kinds of mistakes, right? Because I just didn't know what I didn't know. And she was so good at never giving me hell, but redirecting maybe my thoughts and my processes like that. I look back to that first 5 years that I spent in it, man, in High Prairie. And they were probably the greatest learning that I had. And much of it was, under her tutelage, because she was so caring about kids, caring about teaching. And so she really helped kind of build some things towards, what I became as a leader, going forward. And then later on in my career, and I would see this, and you know this. I look and I heard this in one of your latest series. We didn't, in education, we don't like to look at business because business is wickets and that's what they count. And yet, the opportunity to deal and to, work with some of the corporates at ERDI, like you get a Steve Brown or a Megan Farrell from Nelson and their team, and you listen to what they're doing and how they're leading, and you go, right. And so those people continue to be really good measuring sticks for me, right? So I can pick up the phone, I can phone them and saying, what is it like to work with your board, right? What might be some ways that you're doing this, and they're really good that way. And then the other piece, and this is the advantage that I have, is all the different boards. I'm probably working with about 20% of the boards in Alberta and the territories, and I'm seeing some of the greatest leaders around, right? And seeing the practices. And so those are pieces that I'm just gleaning on and going, thank you very much for this. I know you're paying me, but man, am I learning an awful lot from you, and I'm
Mhm.
going to share it with someone else. Right. And that's the beauty of those things. So
Oh, that's awesome too. And again, I also want to thank you because I know you've mentioned that you've shared a few of my episodes to people as well and connecting. So I think this is all a reciprocal process too that you give and you get so much from that. So here you are. I don't. Again, we're not going to use the word retired because you're retired from superintendent, but you're still doing what you're doing. You kind of alluded to the fact that you might have a little bit more free time. So in that free time, have you found any viewing pleasures? Like, I was always like a guilty pleasure that you've picked
yeah,
up. And it'd be guilty pleasure, but like what's your because I'm always looking for recommendations of what people are watching or binging these days.
yeah. It's funny. My TV is more an escape for me than anything.
Yeah.
When I would come home from especially working, I channel. That's why my wife and I have a number of TVs in our room because, she can watch a show and I have to watch, six of them simultaneously. But we've done the 1883 and the 1923 and the Yellowstone
Right.
and the Crown and stuff like that. I watch a lot of sports like you do. And this will sound sappy, but my wife and I love watching Hallmark movies, especially the ones Christmas, and many times because Canadian actors and lots of the locales are places we visited. So
That's
we'll
right.
see something, say, "Well, yeah, we went there,"
Right.
but I'm not a great, sit down and see it. I use it more for a distraction than anything else, and so I don't have any great shows to give you. So
Well,
sorry about
that
that.
no, that's cool. I thought that's a great little call out, the Hallmark ones. That's again, my wife will watch them, and knowing full well they're sappy, they're
Yep.
predictable, all
Yep.
of those things. Like there's no
Yep.
disguise, but sometimes that's comforting, right? Just like having a staple meal that you go to. No surprises. I know what I'm gonna get, and that's what I want. And yeah, we have
Yep.
one of our local high school graduates here is one of the directors, and he directs a lot of them. So we look at which ones he's directed, and sometimes we'll watch those ones. But yeah, and Alberta is
Yep.
is pretty. And I don't know if that Yellowstone series, some of that was filmed in Alberta or was it all in Montana. But I know there's a lot of shows that get filmed in Alberta, so you can probably find a lot. So and my last question is, uh, Give me give me a hidden gem in the Red Deer area. So for folks driving between Edmonton and Calgary, stopping in Red Deer, what should they go stop and see that they might miss otherwise? Hidden
So
gem.
bring your skates, because in Red Deer, they the city manages, and when I say manage, they look after just about 80 outdoor rinks. So from my house, I can walk about 3 minutes to one, I can walk about 10 minutes to another, or I can drive another, 5 minutes to it. So they have all these outdoor rinks with lights. If they've got a shack on them, they are flooded every day. If they're not, it's just every second day. And so I can walk out our front door and I can hear kids banging pucks back and forth. So bring your
That's
skates in the
awesome.
winter for that's because we don't be able to do that. The
Shacks are
one
heated?
gem that my wife and
The
I
shacks
found,
are heated though?
I'm not even sure because the one I go to is not, but they got a picnic table.
Okay.
You just throw on your skates and you go,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The one gem that my wife and I have found is a little restaurant built just off Taylor in an old brewery called 111. And when I tell people that live in the city, they go, I can't believe this. So they have a date night special that my wife and I go to quite often on a Tuesday. And for $99, you share an appetizer, you each have an entree, you share a dessert, and you get a bottle of wine. And it is a Red Seal chef. And it's a great location and it's a great place to eat. And I tell anybody, if you're coming through Red Deer, you stop at 111 for a meal and you will not be disappointed.
Excellent. Those are two great recommendations. Hey, Chris, so appreciate your time. I know you and we didn't even talk about grandkids and golf, which are probably our two probably biggest passions outside of education. Maybe we can
Absolutely.
figure out a time maybe our paths will cross. We'll get those clubs out and have a game together. I think that'd be fantastic.
I'd love to do that. Love to do it. Thanks very much, Dean. And I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.